to finish up this lecture on chapter 21, we are going to cover the control of blood flow within the tissues and then wrap up with short-term and long-term mechanisms for maintaining homeostasis. So in terms of control for blood flow, it can happen in three ways. Local control, which basically just means the needs of the tissue are going to dictate if we're getting more or less blood. The nervous system, through the sympathetic nervous system, we can stimulate blood vessels. And then hormonal control, also in a way through the nervous system, we can stimulate the release of certain hormones. So local control is really just based on what the tissues need and how the body is going to react to that. So within our capillaries, we have our capillary sphincters, which if they're tightening down, they're going to block blood flow, but if they're loosening up, they're going to allow for vasodilation and allow more blood flow to increase the capillaries. So if we have nutrients that need to go to the capillaries and get to the tissues of whatever organ or organ system we're surrounding, those precapillary sphincters are going to relax and cause vasodilation. So we can have an increase in nutrient-rich blood go through those channels and make their way to those tissues. At some point, or at various points throughout, there will be instances where the tissues of whatever we're looking at are satiated. They have all the oxygen and the glucose we need, and that blood needs to be somewhere else in the body to replenish, restore nutrients, oxygen, etc. So in this case, what's going to happen is those precapillary sphincters are going to clamp down, cause vasoconstriction, and make sure that blood doesn't go into those capillaries and continues on in the blood flow to somewhere else it needs to be. So if the tissues need blood, we're going to have vasodilation to get more blood to them. If the tissues don't need blood, we're going to have vasoconstriction to move the blood elsewhere. Then we have nervous and hormonal control. And there is a little bit of overlap with this with the nervous system. But in terms of just the pure nervous system, we have a structure in the brain called the vasomotor center. It's located roughly between the pons and the medulla oblongata. And the idea is that this vasomotor center connects to all of the blood vessels, the arteries and veins through the nervous system, and is able to contribute sympathetic impulses to do what's called vasomotor tone. And that, much like your muscle tone and your venous tone, is just that there's this constant constriction because these blood vessels are being continuously stimulated by the sympathetic nervous system. And if there, for whatever reason, needs to be, we need to pump the brakes a little bit on the stimulation, we can obviously have an inhibitory situation occur where we have less action potentials firing, and thus those smooth vessels are relaxing, causing vasodilation. And then in terms of hormonal control, we have the adrenal glands, specifically the adrenal medulla on top of the kidney, which from sympathetic stimulation can release epinephrine and norepinephrine, which will go on to blood vessels and stimulate them there. So, in terms of regulating blood pressure, your body actually has a lot of different ways that it can do it. Your book classifies them into short-term regulation and then long-term regulation. So for short-term regulation, a couple of these we covered in the previous chapter. The first one is your baroreceptor reflexes. These just respond to any changes in blood pressure if it's getting too high or getting too low. That can then signal to the brain that there needs to be some sort of physiological change within the heart of the blood vessels to drop blood pressure if it's getting too high or increase blood pressure if it's getting too low. Then we have, similar to what I just mentioned on the previous slide, the adrenal medullary mechanism, where the sympathetic nervous system can send epinephrine and norepinephrine to vessels in order to stimulate them. Then we have chemoreceptor reflexes, which we also covered this in the last chapter, but this is just the feedback loop mechanism for if there are changes in oxygen levels, carbon dioxide levels, or pH levels within the blood. This can be picked up on information is then sent to the brain, which will then make the according changes to increase oxygen levels or decrease CO2 levels or change pH if it's getting too high or too low. The last short-term regulation you have is called the central nervous system ischemic response. And this basically happens when there's too much carbon dioxide, not enough oxygen, or a pH is getting too low, too acidic within the brain. Ultimately, this is sort of a last-ditch effort for the brain to maintain its oxygen levels or not get too acidic. And what happens is there is a bunch of vasoconstriction going on, which is going to increase the blood pressure in the body and hopefully push more oxygenated blood into the brain. This is usually something that happens when an individual has a heart attack or is in cardiac arrest or having a stroke. It's sort of, again, a last-ditch effort to get more blood to the brain. This reflex or this response only lasts for a couple minutes. And the idea is that if we get past that point, usually the individual dies because the body is using this response as a last-ditch effort to get oxygen to the brain. So then you have a couple different long-term regulations for blood pressure. The first one is called your renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism. So that's involving 3 different substances. You have renin, you have angiotensin, and then you have aldosterone. So to break this down, when you have a decrease in blood pressure, that blood that's flowing through the kidneys will pick up on this change and ultimately release the compound renin. That renin will go on to intercept a compound called angiotensinogen, which is released by your liver. When the renin interacts with the angiotensinogen, that converts angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 then goes into the lung capillaries and with a special enzyme gets converted to angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 is the actual major player in this mechanism. So angiotensin 2 is going to do 2 things. It's going to go to the blood vessels and cause vasoconstriction, which is ultimately going to increase blood pressure. And the second job is that it's going to go to the adrenal glands on top of the kidneys and stimulate release of the hormone aldosterone. Aldosterone is going to go to the target tissue of the kidney and ultimately allow for more water to be reabsorbed. We're going to talk about this a lot when we do the urinary system, but there's a lot of links between blood volume and blood pressure and how much the body is going to be excreting in the urine in order to maintain these qualities. But for right now, what you just need to know is that the aldosterone goes to the kidney, which causes it to conserve more water, which ultimately raises blood pressure again. Then you have a second hormonal mechanism called ADH. ADH stands for antidiuretic hormone, What happens is in the posterior pituitary within the brain, if the blood pressure again drops, gets too low, you have the antidiuretic hormone released from the posterior pituitary of the brain. And similar to your aldosterone, it does 2 things. It goes to the blood vessels and causes some vasoconstriction, and also increases the reabsorption of water, which, because we increase the blood volume, we're then increasing the blood pressure. And then the 3 other long-term regulations of blood pressure. First, we have your atrial natriuretic hormone, and you see the word atrial in the title of that, so you know that this hormone is actually coming from the heart. It's coming from the atria of the heart. So this is when within the atria, the blood pressure is getting too high. It needs to be dropped down a little bit. Ultimately, this hormone is going to be released, and it's going to cause an increase in urinary production. So we're getting more blood being filtered into the kidneys to then filter out more urine. Ultimately, that's going to decrease blood volume and thus decrease blood pressure. Then you have what's called fluid shift, and this is again when we have a drop in blood pressure. What's going to happen is the interstitial spaces, which I didn't get too much into this, but they're outside the capillaries. We're going to have more fluid move from those spaces to the capillaries, and because we are reabsorbing more blood, we're increasing that blood volume. We're going to have an increase in blood pressure. And the last one that your book goes over is the stress relaxation response. And this is just when we have a large drop in blood volume and thus blood pressure. Ultimately, you're going to have smooth muscle within those blood vessels contract. Again, they're going to vasoconstrict, tightening down, and that's going to increase blood pressure. So that's all we have for chapter 21. And I will see you next time for the lymphatic system.